Okay, hello and welcome everyone to Lecture 14, in which we will talk about the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. That's actually a book title from decades ago by a historian by the name of Edward Gibbon. And his theories, just in case you were curious, has largely been discredited about what exactly happened during this time period. The way he saw it back then, if you were curious, and I'm sure you are, was that the Roman Empire fell apart due to the twin terrible forces of barbarism and religion. He blamed the rise of Christianity and the reliance of Rome on barbarian forces for the collapse of the empire. Now, in the decades since, historians have largely discounted Gibbon's conclusions as well as his analysis of the situation. What happens in the lecture that we're about to get into today is a description really of transformation. The Roman Empire was unbelievably big and very politically complex. And over the next few centuries of lecture, we're going to talk about how it really transforms from, as I've described here in tiny little letters, a very long drawn out transformation of the Roman Empire from one complicated series of social and political processes into a series of different complicated social and political processes, which takes centuries and is arguably still happening, depending on how you understand the Roman Empire and what it means. Some people are going to, in case you want an explanation for that, some people are going to include the Catholic Church as an intrinsic part of the Roman Empire. And so in that way, you could see it as, in some ways, still surviving. That's a bit of a stretch, but there we go. Here we go. Let's get into it. Okay, so where last we left off, we were talking about 4th century problems. The 3rd century was a crisis. The 4th century is full of challenges. That's where we saw the rise of Christianity. We talked about that in our lecture last time. Constantine, and then the civil war following Constantine when his sons battle it out over his territory. His nephew Julian attempts to go back to being pagan for a while. That doesn't pan out. Others are going to rise. The empire is going to split once more into East and West, this time really for good. There really isn't going to be anybody who truly controls all of it again. Justinian will make an effort, but that's really beside the point. And because there's all of this challenge, there's a great deal of unrest inside the empire, but then outside, if you can look at that map that's just kind of cut off in the bubble there to your left, that red line represents the borders, the frontiers, the borders of the Roman Empire. And the people on the other side of those borders frequently caused problems. They would sometimes raid across the border, steal things, jump back across the border, and scuttle off and hide. This is one way that they caused problems. Sometimes there would be major expeditions, invasions that had to be put down. Defending borders this size, when you don't have a particularly large or coherent government that's always working at its best all the time, is an enormous challenge. So in the 4th century, one of the things that the Roman army does, in order to concentrate their forces on where they see their real powerful enemies, namely on the Persian border, where a big empire had once again coalesced. They're referred to as the Sasanian Persians in this case. And they're a real kind of constant existential threat to the eastern part of the empire, which is the rich part full of people. And so in order to kind of deal with the western frontier, that European frontier especially, Romans leaned more heavily and heavily on groups of people known as the Federati. Federati just means kind of like confederates, allies, people who are your friends. And what this was, they were military contractors, really. The Romans would hire out people to fight alongside their army, defend borders, generally do all the kind of nasty, unpleasant military jobs they might have handy. And they generally hired people who they qualified and described as barbarians, usually from across the border. So if you can read that tiny little print of the names of the people who are on the other side of the Roman border, the Gothi, the Cadi, the Marcomanni, the Chatti, these are all people who are sometimes hired by the Romans to work on behalf of Rome, to help defend the frontier from the other side in some cases, and create a buffer zone so that if any other more warlike groups of people, not that they Gothi and the Cadi were not warlike, but if any more hostile to Rome types of people were to come and threaten the border, that these foederati would help. And the foederati don't just stay on the border either. They're going to be kind of worked into the Roman legions as auxiliary troops. And whenever there's a major expedition, whether they're fighting against the Persians or the Parthians, or whether they're fighting on a distant frontier, it is not at all uncommon for Roman armies to lean more and more heavily on these foederati units. At first, the foederati were kind of considered the scut troops, people who did the nasty jobs, people who did the stuff that you really wasn't maybe that super important, but you just kind of needed to throw cannon fodder bodies in the way. Now, there's no cannons, but you know what I mean. Catapult fodder, I guess, in the way of, your enemies. That was the job they always stuck with the foederati with. But over the years, the equipment of these foederati units and their weaponry is going to become more advanced. It's going to become much more in line with what the Romans themselves used in the regular legion. Now, early on in the 4th century, every time a conflict arose and foederati units came up against actual units of Roman legions, and this happened because, remember, civil war is not at all unusual in the Roman Empire. Whenever that happened, every stinking time, the way it went down was that the actual regular Roman legion would absolutely destroy the foederati. They would just crush them, and that would be the end of it. And that becomes the situation that Roman armies start to get comfortable with. They use these foederati as extra troops, extra bodies, but in the early part of the 4th century, they don't really take them seriously as a potential rival, as really the same or equal to Roman soldiers. That's going to change over the 4th century. By the end, that's not necessarily going to be the circumstance anymore. The foederati, who've spent, in some cases, generations fighting alongside the Romans, not only improve their equipment, but they improve their tactical understanding, expertise, and experience as well. Some of these troops end up being very, very highly accomplished. Now, you add in to that the fact that the 4th and 5th centuries are sometimes referred to as the age of migrations. People begin moving around. Some of the reason for that may be there's all kinds of theories that different historians espouse. Some people argue that there's some climate shift involved. Some people argue that it's simply political. Certainly, there's going to be the rise of a new group by the time you get well into the 4th century, known as the Huns. And they're going to start pressing on the eastern border of lands occupied by these foederati, notably the Goths. And this is going to result in some political fragmentation of the Goths, who were long-time kind of military contractors. They had deals with Rome going back many years. And this pressure is going to end up creating kind of a domino effect. One group is going to kind of push on the next group's territory. It's going to push on the next group's territory. And there's going to be a great deal of shakeup and pressure on the border of Rome. Different groups of people are going to want to enter. Different groups inside are going to start wanting to move around. It ends up being a somewhat chaotic time when you have lots of different ethnic groups moving around. And when I say ethnic groups, we're using these terms kind of loosely because they don't necessarily correspond to our modern understanding of what race and ethnicity is all about. It doesn't translate that well to the ancient world. So when I say groups of people, I'm usually using language as an identifier, people who all kind of speak the same language, who generally perceive themselves to be part of the same group because they speak the same language, because they fight in the same armies, wear the same kinds of clothes, have the same kind of cultural stories and expectations. We can broadly consider that an ethnicity. So what's happening is you have these different groups and they're all kind of moving about, and this causes some challenges for Rome. They don't really make any effort to actually stop this movement, but they do end up having problems because some of these ethnic groups, notably the Goths, the Vandals, the Lombards, etc., are going to come into hostile contact with Roman territory. Okay, so let's get to that. Alrighty, so on the eastern part of the empire, the Persians are pushing on the border. They want to expand their empire back into the grand old days of Xerxes and Darius and have a great Persian empire once again. And obviously, Rome doesn't want that to happen because they're currently occupying that territory. And so they're going to use a lot of their federati and their own legionary forces to try to push that back. But while they're occupied, to the north, there's going to be an expansion of the Huns, as I just mentioned earlier, into the territory of the Goths. Now, the Huns are going to do a big, fast territorial expansion, and you're going to see this repeated in Central Asia a few times. They're going to come out of the steppe area. They're the core of their army. Their army will ultimately become very diverse, but the core of it initially is their cavalry. It's light armored cavalry that moves very fast. They're very famous for using bows that are made out of a composite material, wood and bone, that are very strong, and so they can shoot arrows that will puncture armor, at least light armor, and they can shoot from horseback, and so they use this really fast-moving, light armored cavalry to be the kind of arrowhead that pushes into territory. And then they use the time-honored tradition, much like the Persians had before them, of establishing a big territorial empire by getting together a big army, rolling up to towns, and issuing the ultimatum, join us or die. And as each town joins, as people start either, having to deal with that ultimatum, they're either conquered and end up rolled up into the Huns army, or they surrender and are rolled up into the Huns army. That army just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and more diverse the further they go and the more success they have. Well, what happens is that by the middle of the 4th century, they're pushing on the territory of the Goths. The Goths are long established allies of the Romans. They fight in a way that the Romans really find very useful. They use mostly infantry, and they fight pretty much like Roman legionary forces do. And so what happens in 376 is that the Goths, fearful of being overwhelmed by the Huns, apply to Rome for help. And the emperor in the east at that time is a guy named Valens. There is an emperor in the west too, but we're not going to worry about him just yet. And the guy in the east is the one they have to deal with. And Valens cuts them a deal. He meets with the leader of the Goths, a guy by the name of Fritigern. Now, the Goths had split earlier into two basic groups, two kind of arms, the East Goths and the West Goths. And Fritigern represents the West Goths, the Visigoths. The East Goths, the Ostrogoths, are kind of a separate people. We'll get to them later. Anyway, Fritigern comes and negotiates with Valens, and he cuts the biggest federati deal that had ever been cut. It's basically a military contract that says the Goths, their families, their livestock, their whole people and communities will be allowed to cross the borders into the Roman Empire and settle into land that Valens will supply for them. Much the same way that Roman emperors very traditionally supplied settlement colonies for retired soldiers. It's the same concept. Valens promises to provide this. He will provide land for the Goths to settle on. He'll pay them big lump sums of money, and he'll make sure that they have the stuff that they need to set themselves up in a new life. In return for that, he expects basically all of the available soldiers in the Gothic people that are being allowed to move in to serve as federati in the Roman army. And he intends to deploy them against the Persians to reinforce that border against the Huns. And then together, the Goths and the Romans will push back on all their enemies and keep the border safe. That was the goal. So Valens cuts this deal. The Goths cross the border. They get paid at least part of their money. But then there's a delay. They come across and they're waiting for the land to be settled. It's not going as smoothly as Valens hoped. There were more Goths than he really anticipated. And then on top of that, it wasn't as easy as he thought to locate, secure, and purchase land. And so he hadn't really decided where they were going to settle. And so these kind of refugee camps were set up for the Goths. And then all of the local people who lived near where the Goths were kind of encamped as refugees, start immediately taking terrible advantage of them. And I mean terrible advantage. In the meantime, I should have mentioned this earlier, part of the condition for them to enter the empire was that if they were not Christian already, and some were, but if they were not Christian already, they had to convert to Christianity. And this makes for a little bit of a complicating factor, because the Goths who convert to Christianity don't convert to Nicene Christianity. They don't convert to Christianity that Constantine had approved. They convert to a different type called Aryan Christianity. This has nothing to do with that like Nazi racist philosophy, Aryan with a Y. This is Aryan with an I, and it just refers to a different formulation of the Trinity. In the Nicene version, the Trinity is considered to be equal, co-eternal, and co-equal, so that God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit are all three persons in one God. So there's one God, three persons, and they're all equal, and they're all co-eternal with each other. The Arian formulation says that there's God, then there's Jesus, then there's the Holy Spirit. And they didn't all exist from the very beginning, and they're not equal. It's a hierarchy. So, since Valens believed that, and he was the emperor, he invoked that notion of Caesaropapism. I'm the emperor, therefore I'm in charge of religious matters. And that was officially the form of Christianity that was the approved one in the Roman Empire. And so when the Goths convert, they convert to that type, Aryan Christianity. It's going to be relevant later, I promise. Okay, so back to them being in their refugee camps. They're in the refugee camps. They've got some cash in their pockets, but they don't have any permanent place to live or any way to make their living. Some of the troops are hauled off to be federati immediately. Others are still kind of waiting for things to be resolved. What happens is that the locals take terrible advantage of this situation. And I know this and we know this, I suppose, from Roman sources. This isn't something the Goths are writing down after the fact to make Romans look bad. This is something Romans themselves are going to record about the conflict that's about to happen. And what they record is that the situation had gotten so bad in these settlements, these temporary settlements, and Goths had gotten so hungry and so desperate that locals were offering them the following trade. Local people would exchange a dog to eat to the Goths in exchange for a Gothic child who would then be taken off into slavery and sold at a profit. Now, here's the thing. If you are going to exploit and generally oppress people, and I don't recommend that you ever do so, but if you are going to exploit and generally oppress people, the absolute worst group of persons you can choose to exploit and oppress are professional soldiers. This is just a basic truth of history that you should probably hold to your hearts and remember. And Rome is going to learn that very much the hard way. It gets terrible. The Goths hit their breaking point and they decide they're not playing anymore, and they go into rebellion. And when they go into rebellion with the benefit of military experience, technology, techniques, and a sort of deep understanding of the political and military context in which they are acting. These are federati. They're not just random barbarians from someplace. These are people who have a lot of experience fighting alongside as well as against Roman troops. They know what they're doing. And in addition to that, they have for years made up a good part of Rome's military strength. And so when they go into rebellion, this compromises the army even further. So Fritigern calls all of the Goths together and they go on a rampage. They go from town to town, and basically this is what it boils down to. The Goths will roll up to your town and demand to be paid off in food or cash. And if the town pays them off, then they just roll over to the next town and leave you alone. And if the town doesn't pay them off, they loot and burn everything that they can get hold of, steal everything that isn't nailed down, and then roll on to the next town. Well, Valens is not about to tolerate this. He's invited these Goths in, and now they're on a rampage. He's not going to put up with it. So he calls in the army and goes off to deal with them. Meanwhile, the Western Emperor, who's actually had a good deal more experience working directly with the Goths to defend the border, a guy named Gratian, is going to send urgent letters to Valens saying, wait. Don't go confront the Goths on your own. They're serious troops. Wait until I can join you with my legion so that we have overwhelming force. Do not engage them. Wait for me. Valens dismisses this. He's like, oh, that's ridiculous. Everybody knows when federati come up against regular legions, the federati are destroyed. That's just what happens. Everybody knows that's what happens. So I'm not going to wait. I'm going to wade into this and deal with them myself, and then I'll be a hero. So he takes his legions and he marches against the Goths. He's going to encounter their forces at the Battle of Adrianople in 378. And here's what happens at Adrianople. Valens goes to scout out the Gothic camp. What's going on? How many people are there? His scouts return with a count, but that count is flawed. The Goths had set up their camp in a wooded area. And they had kind of made a semicircle of their wagons with their kind of women and children in them sort of protectively inside the center of it. And there were some Gothic troops kind of hanging around guarding the camp. And that's what the scouts return and report on. But what they don't realize is that the bulk of the Gothic army is away from camp. They're either in the forest foraging or they have gone on scouting missions themselves. They're not there. So Valens gets an incorrect number. He assumes that there are far fewer Goths than there actually are. And so he decides now is a great moment to attack. He's going to go right at them. And so he orders his forces forward to go and attack them. The Goths set up a defensive position, as I mentioned, and they managed to hold off Valens until, galloping out of the woods, comes the rest of the Gothic army. The cavalry comes running back, the rest of the army comes running back, and the tide turns really rapidly and unpleasantly for Valens. The Goths are going to flank them, come around the Roman side, and absolutely crush the Roman legions. Now, this was a shocking thing to happen. The Federati went up against the regular legion, and not only did they win, it was a rout. They absolutely destroyed the army sent against them. They're going to kill at least 2/3 of the Roman troops that were engaged in this battle. Valens himself, the emperor, dies. They never recover his body. They don't really know what happened to him, but he died. Somewhere he's gone. Something between 15,000 and 40,000 troops are ultimately going to die, Roman troops. And the Goths themselves will not take nearly this kind of casualty level. So, at the end of this, the balance of power fundamentally changes. The Goths not only avoided getting crushed for their rebellion, they are kind of left in possession of the field. Now the Western Emperor has to decide what he's going to do on his own to deal with them, and he's not in a position to join with the East any longer to bring overwhelming forces against them because the Goths have destroyed those forces. So now that assumption that Rome had leaned on for almost 800 years, that there's nobody really powerful enough to threaten Rome itself, is no longer a safe assumption. The balance has shifted. Now they're going to have to deal with these Federati more like equals, more like people they actually have to care about and deal with without just simply ordering them around and assuming they'll have the upper hand. Okay, so Fritigern, what does he do after all of this? He forces concessions from basically everyone in Rome. Gratian and the new emperor in the east, Theodosius, come to a peace treaty with him. He agrees to stand down and stop attacking everyone. In return, they agree that they will allow his people to settle somewhere on Roman territory and establish themselves some land that they can farm and use as permanent place to live and rule and have for themselves. And over the next several decades, what they're going to end up doing, these Visigoths, as they come to be known, the West Goths, are going to basically serve as on again, off again Federati for the Romans. They're going to continue fighting alongside Roman troops, very famously against Huns. We'll get to that in just a bit. But sometimes it really doesn't go that smoothly. It doesn't. It isn't always straightforward, the relationship. Sometimes they're going to push back against Roman cities, communities, towns. Sometimes they'll go back to that standard of demanding payoffs in return for, maintaining the peace. And so negotiating a relationship with the Goths requires this constant vigilance and effort. And that's going to be maintained through the work of a couple of leaders. First, you have Alaric. He's going to be the leader of the Visigoths. That's a painting of him there in the center there on the horse. And he is going to be the one who takes the Visigoths out of what is now Greece and toward the west, toward Italy itself, where he's going to end up engaged in a very cordial relationship with this guy Stiliko. Stiliko had a job that was increasingly important in the 4th and 5th centuries in Rome. His actual title was Magister Militis, or Master of Soldiers. So he's not the emperor, he's not a senator, he's not a praetorian prefect, he's not anything like that. He's kind of outside that traditional Roman aristocratic hierarchy, but he has this very important functional job. He's the liaison between Roman troops, including Roman foederati, and the Senate and Emperor of Rome. So that's his position, that's his job. He actually mediates and negotiates the relationship between the army and, if you want to call it that, government leadership. He's brilliant at this job. And like many of the Magister Milites that we're going to see in the 4th and 5th centuries, Stiliko was chosen in part because his own ancestry made him it gave him an advantage when this choice was being made. He was half Vandal. That's one of the barbarians that were frequently served as foederati on the borders, and half Roman. He was raised in Rome by a Roman mother. He married an upper-class Roman wife. He definitely knew how to move in the circles of the Roman senators, for instance. But because he was genetically, I don't know if genetically is the right word, but because he was ethnically tied also to people who considered themselves outsiders, not Romans exactly. They were considered by Roman senators to be barbarians. Because of that, the assumption was that he occupied this natural liaison position, that he could negotiate between the two sides. He was considered as valid by both the foederati and by the regular legion and by the Roman Senate. And he justified this faith. He was very, very politically astute. He was very good at his job. And through his negotiations and through his military command and leadership, the alliance between the Goths and the Romans holds pretty strong. But then, what happens is that the Senate starts to feel threatened. The Magister Militis becomes more and more important as the years go on. Because he has so much sway over and control in the army is the one who really makes and breaks Roman emperors, and everybody knows it. And because that's the reality, the Roman Senate, who have really been living in a kind of bubble, I guess you could call it, where they are insulated in large part from the political realities that they themselves take part in. The Roman Senate is made up of aristocrats. It's made up of people who own large swaths of land. They have huge numbers of clients. They have enormous numbers of servants. They have tons of people who answer to them, and they are super duper offensively rich. They are super rich. And in many ways, what this means is that they are able to go around ignoring political reality. The fact is, they don't really control the emperor. They don't really control political events. Instead, most of the real power is concentrated in the army. And in some sense, they know this, but in other senses, they kind of don't. And I'll show you an example of that in just a second. Here's one terrible mistake they make. They decide that Stiliko is getting too uppity, that he's sort of threatening to overspill the boundaries of what his job is, that he's getting too ambitious. And so he's assassinated in 408. And alongside Stiliko, the wives and children of Federati, who were living in Rome, some of them as hostages, some of them not, are also going to be rounded up and killed as a way of showing that the traditional Roman Senate and legions, etc., would not be pushed around by these lousy barbarians. Alaric, the leader of the Goths, as you can imagine, is deeply offended by this, killing women and children and slaying his political counterpart, Stiliko. All of this was considered deep provocation. So Alaric is going to take his army. Alaric takes his army and marches to Rome. And he besieges the city itself, something that had not happened since the Gauls did it in 390 BC. It has been 800 years since this was a political possibility. And the Senate shows themselves to be very much in deep denial of their actual situation. Alaric gives them an ultimatum: pay me off, find me land for my people to settle on once and for all, give me a great big cash settlement, stop with all of this nonsense of targeting Federati, accept peace treaties with me, and basically military contract deals with my people, the Visigoths, as well. And I will leave you in peace. I'll go away, and that will be the end of it. Otherwise, we're sacking the city. And the Senate, their reaction is really kind of odd. Now, the emperor himself is not there. He's not inside the city. Honorius, who happens to be the emperor at this time, has relocated to Ravenna. Ravenna is a city very close to where Venice is now. It's in the north on the, I guess you could say, the east coast of Italy. So it's the top of the boot, as it were. And it's right on the coastal area. It's got a wonderful harbor, so ships can get in and out easily. But the city of Ravenna itself is surrounded by nasty, marshy swamp, with a very small and narrow area of approach to the city itself, and a big thick wall. So it's really, really defensible. You can easily get in and out of there by sea, but you can almost impossible to attack it by land because of the nasty swamp. So, the emperor is ensconced safe at Ravenna. The Senate, however, is still in Rome. They've never moved, and they are massively rich. They have lots of clients. They have lots of wealth. They have lots of money, and they are in deep denial about how vulnerable they actually are. So, when Alaric makes his ultimatum and he says, pay me off or else, they don't believe him. They're like, nah, we're not paying you off. We don't negotiate with barbarians. We're not having this. No, you just go away. And Alaric's like, okay, if that's how you want it. And he overwhelms the walls, sends his troops into the city of Rome, and sacks the city for 3 days. Burning, looting, stealing, raping, doing all the horrible things that armies that sack cities do. He does exercise some restraint. Church leaders will point this out after the fact. People who take shelter in churches, for instance, are left alone. The churches themselves are not looted. Alaric is a Christian after all, and he acknowledges and respects people's sort of right to religious sanctuary. And after 3 days, this is another example of just how much control Alaric has over his troops, he tells his troops, that's it, out, we're done. Everybody reform outside the walls. That's enough sacking for now. And he is able to effectively stop the looting and sacking of the city of Rome kind of on a dime. His troops leave the city itself. The ultimatum is put to the Senate once again, and this time Alaric and the Visigoths get paid off. They get paid in gold, silver, textiles, pepper, and they're forced to release all their barbarian slaves. The slaves the Romans would define as barbarian. And then the Visigoths take all of these people along with their own, and they make their way to Spain, where it's part of Roman territory. But they grab up land, settle it down, and create a kingdom, an independent kingdom, inside the boundaries of the Roman Empire, which Rome does acknowledge. So you can definitely point to this and see it as the beginning of the process where the Western Empire is falling apart. Now, I want to emphasize, during this entire process, the Eastern Emperor is still a powerful figure. The eastern part of the Roman Empire is still very wealthy and full of people. They're not strong enough militarily to stop the Visigoths in the West, but it's really the West that is going to stop looking recognizably like Rome, like the Roman Empire, not the East. The East is just going to continue. Okay. That being said, what happens next is terribly, terribly upsetting to a great many people who have lived in the Roman Empire and have really lived under the umbrella of the Roman Empire for centuries and never really considered that it might be under threat. People all over the place are deeply, deeply shaken by the notion that Rome itself has been sacked by barbarians. In 426, Augustine of Hippo is going to publish his work, The City of God. He begins writing it immediately after the whole sack of Rome business. But it's huge. If you've ever seen The City of God, it's enormous. So it takes him a while to get finished with it. But in it, this is going to be a very ideologically important text. In it, what Augustine does is he breaks that connection we talked about in discussion last time when we talked about Eusebius and Constantine. After the Roman Empire adopts Christianity or favors Christianity or legalizes Christianity, there was a wave of Christian thinkers like Eusebius who see this as destiny, that the fate of Rome and Christianity should be tied together forever, and it's going to be a great triumph, and everything is going to win in the end, and Christianity will spread to the entire world on the backs of Roman soldiers, and that's going to be great. Well, now Rome is in deep, deep trouble. They've been sacked by barbarians. They are chastened, if you will. And it no longer looks like Rome is the wagon they want to be hitched to anymore. And what Augustine does in The City of God is he describes how it is ideologically and philosophically and theologically okay to unhitch the two, to say that the success or failure of Rome, in fact, has nothing to do with the success or failure of Christianity. That rather than being obsessed with the earthly city, the city of Rome, we should instead be thinking about the heavenly city of God, the heavenly Jerusalem. And he doesn't even mean literally the Jerusalem. He just means the heavenly community of all believers. That's what really counts. And it doesn't matter what happens politically. And so he undermines, in a sense, that notion of Caesaropapism, the idea that the emperor should also be the leader of the church, whether he's a good Christian or a bad Christian or whatever he is. He puts just the first wedge in that notion that maybe the church and the government should be considered separate from one another. And it doesn't really matter if Rome, therefore, has some serious political setbacks, military setbacks, that doesn't necessarily impact Christianity or the ultimate goal of Christianity even triumphing over everybody and spreading all over the place. Because what we should be thinking about, according to Augustine, is the community of believers, and that transcends all political affiliation. He also attempts to answer the question of why good things happen to bad people and why bad things happen to good people. And in terms of the latter, he talks about how, yes, it's terrible that, barbarians might be coming to your town to sack and burn and rape and cause all kinds of pillaging, but you should consider this not as a failure of the divine, a failure of God to protect his people, but instead a correction. People are essentially sinful after all, and life is short. Eternity is eternity. So if some bad things happen to you in this time, you should consider it a sort of a discipline. This is a way of testing your faith. This is a way of providing you with some correction if you've gotten a little lazy and a little self-satisfied. And you should think of it as something in proper context. That if you maintain your faith, if you try to be a good Christian and keep your faith, then you will pass into a heavenly reward that will last forever and ever and ever. And whatever you happen to endure in this life is really inconsequential compared compared to that. So that's Augustine's answer. You may or may not be satisfied by it. Anyway, okay, going on. Alrighty, so what happens next? Well, Honorius, who is the Western emperor, was apparently pretty useless at this point. There was a rumor. This may not be true. I want to emphasize that. But this was widely believed to be true. The rumor went all around at the time. He was, if you remember, ensconced at Ravenna. If you can see that tiny little map down there on the left, that little green spot, that's where Ravenna is. It's up there, as you can see, on the Adriatic. And since he was in this very safe palace, when Rome was sacked in 410 AD, riders came galloping up to Ravenna. Messengers come dashing into the throne room. They run up to the emperor, and they tell him the news breathlessly. Your Majesty, Rome has been destroyed. And it turns out, this is the rumor, brace yourselves, it's a fun story, that Honorius had a number of pet chickens. He just liked them. He used to feed them and he found them amusing. And he named them after all the important cities of the empire. So there was Roma and Ravenna and Constantinopolita and, etc., Alexandria. And they were all just sort of named after various cities. And when the messenger comes up and tells him Rome has been destroyed, he's aghast. He's like, oh no, that's horrible news. I fed her just this morning. What could have happened to her? Okay, so that was the rumor that went around. That's how out of touch this emperor was. He had no idea what was going on. Regardless of whether or not that's true, the actual political reality is that the emperor's power in the West erodes to basically nothing. Instead, it becomes clear that the real power is in the hands of the Magister Militis, that guy who negotiates between the armies, including the armies of the Foederati, and the Senate and the actual government. That's the guy calling the shots. Nobody even bothers to talk to the emperor practically anymore. So that's the reality. Another big power shift. It turns out that the person actually running the barbarian army starts to be emperor in almost everything but name. Okay, so that leads us to our favorite Hunnic leader, Attila. There he is. He's going to pull together and rally a big army of Huns. The same method that we already talked about, join us or die. It ends up being quite a diverse army, as I mentioned. It's full of infantry. It's full of people from all over the place. But the core and heart of it will always be that fast, light cavalry that the Huns are so incredibly accomplished at putting together. And under Attila's leadership, he's going to negotiate very heavily with the Romans. He's a fascinating figure. You could have a whole class just on Attila if you wanted to. Under his leadership, the territory controlled by the Huns is going to spread well into Europe until 451 at the Battle of the Catalonian Fields, where a united Gothic and Roman army are going to form up in order to confront Attila kind of one decisive time to determine it all. And in this battle, the combined forces of the Goths and the Romans are able to overthrow the Huns, to destroy them, and to kill Attila himself. He dies, and after his death, the coalition that had been put together, that he'd put together largely through charismatic leadership, falls apart. And the Huns just kind of dissolve into a variety of different ethnic groups and kind of disappear and don't really become politically powerful after that. But this threat ends up politically uniting the forces of the Romans and the Goths much more strongly than would have been possible without the Huns and their threat. It's going to force the Romans to kind of settle their differences with the Goths. Now, what's going on in Italy? You are absolutely not responsible for this information. I have just listed it to give you a sense of what's happening. So it's politically an absolute disaster. The emperors really don't have much power anymore. The Senate is struggling to figure out how they fit into all of this, and they don't have the power they once thought they did anymore. And the whole thing is just a political just a cluster. It's a mess. So to give you some indication of just what I mean by that. Okay, so Honorius, remember the guy with the chickens? He dies. His nephew Valentinian III takes the throne. He's going to be assassinated by a senator named Petronius Maximus in 454. Petronius Maximus is stoned to death in the street 11 weeks later. So he lasts 11 weeks as emperor, and then a mob stones him to death. Then the Vandals sack the city again. 455, just days after the stoning. So another group of people, not the Goths, but the Vandals, that actually is what they're called. And then the word Vandal that we use is named after them. So that gives you some indication. They earned that, by the way, not because they were especially rude by barbarian standards or especially destructive, but because unlike the Goths, they do loot churches. And the people who write down surviving history from this time period are church clergy members. And so they really can't stand the Vandals. And so the Vandals get a terrible reputation. Anyway, Avitus, a Gallo-Roman senator, so he's from France. That's what we would consider Gaul, assumed the throne, but he's deposed when the mood in the city turns against him. So he's put on the throne, and then his Magister Militis, the guy he'd chosen to serve as the liaison with the army, Ricimer, spares his life, but forced him to become a bishop. So here's how much the power shift had happened. Avitus is this guy who was a part of the Roman aristocracy. He is proclaimed the emperor, but the crowd doesn't really like or approve of him, so his barbarian Magister Militis basically says, all right, I'm not going to kill you, but you're going to have to go off and be a bishop because we're going to have to find somebody better. Ricimer stays in power, but then Majorian is ultimately going to be raised to the throne. He was a general in the army, and Ricimer picks him. So now you have the barbarians basically hand-picking emperors to serve or not serve. So Ricimer does that. Then he tries to restore the territory of the West, but it doesn't work. And Leo I, the Eastern emperor, refuses to acknowledge him. So you have more conflict between these Western emperors that are more or less the puppets of their Magister Militis and the Eastern emperor who's still powerful, who doesn't necessarily want to negotiate with them. Okay, then Ricimer turns on Majorian and has him arrested, tortured, and executed. He places a random Roman senator, Libius Severus, on the throne in 461. Libius Severus lasts for 4 years until 465, serving as the mouthpiece for Ricimer until he dies, evidently of natural causes. So he actually gets to live out his life. Then Leo I chooses Anthemius, a Roman noble with Eastern connections, to come after Libius Severus. But Ricimer gets sick of Anthemius' efforts to actually rule, and he kills him after a nasty series of confrontations in 472. So the Eastern emperor attempts to put somebody on the throne who actually will run the show and not just do what his Magister Militis says so, and the Magister Militis just has him killed. Then, Ricimer raises Olybrius to the throne to use as a puppet. Shortly afterwards, Ricimer dies of an illness, and so 7 months later, so does Olybrius. He dies, and after he died, he'd been replaced by another Magister Militis named Gundobad, probably a Burgundian, king of the Burgundians, as it says right there. And Gundobad attempts to kind of fill Ricimer's shoes and act in the same kind of way. Olybrius was replaced by Glycerius, but he wasn't recognized by the Eastern Emperor. The Eastern Emperor appoints a guy named Julius Nepos. Then there's going to be a nasty fight. Julius Nepos will ultimately be deposed and assassinated by Orestes, Magister Militis, and possibly a Hun. We're not really sure what Orestes' ethnic background was, but he's going to replace Gundobad. And so once Orestes is in charge as Magister Militis, he's going to put his son, he's not even going to bother pretending that this isn't just a puppet show. He's going to choose his young son, Romulus Augustulus, whom he must have named just for this purpose, on the throne. So it's 475. Romulus Augustulus is named emperor in the West. If you remember, Romulus was the traditional founder of Rome. Augustus was the first emperor of Rome. So that is meant to be a significant name. So Romulus Augustulus, little Romulus Augustus, is put on the throne. But then the year later, in 476, he's going to be deposed and exiled. They don't even bother to kill him because he's just such a hapless kid. And he's not really very much of a threat because his father, Orestes, was really the power, and he's going to be killed. Orestes will be killed by a fellow by the name of Odoacer. Odoacer declares himself to be king of Italy. Rex Italia. He doesn't bother with a puppet emperor. Instead, he just calls a spade and acknowledges that he's ruling this place. Now, the whole point of this, there's a certain poetry to it. Romulus Augustulus was the name given to this puppet emperor, named after the founder of Rome and the first emperor. And he's going to be deposed and replaced by a man who calls himself King of Italy. Remember what they swore they'd never have in Rome again, despite the fact that they've had emperors that functionally are the same thing for years? A king in Rome. At this point, Rome is so beat down in the West. They are so tired of the constant political shuffling. They are so frightened and ruined by invasion after sacking, after looting, after invasion, after just pressure, civil war, that they don't even care. Odoacer declares himself king of Italy, and nobody in the West even objects. They're just, whatever, fine. They accept it. So here's an image, later imagining, of Odoacer, king of Italy. Note the barbarian mustache. There's only a few images that survived at all from Odoacer's reign. One of the things that these guys did, who wanted to set themselves apart from, I guess, traditional Roman aristocracy, was that they adopted different hair and facial hairstyles to mark themselves out as barbarian, to mark themselves out as not part of the traditional Roman elite. And they really did have to take these steps because in many ways, the Roman elite had always been a much more porous institution than we might think. There are people from all over the provinces who end up incorporated into that class of people. It's more fluid than we generally think of aristocracies as being. The Romans were not especially hung up on the idea of genetic purity in any meaningful way. They did have an idea of cultural tradition being important, but they had always been a culture that allowed for relatively free and open naturalization. They freed slaves and made them citizens. The children of slaves were full citizens with all full rights. They had the same status as other Romans. They really encouraged immigration and people to move into the city of Rome itself and into the Roman Empire. They granted citizenship freely to members of the provinces. At this point, everybody inside the boundaries of Rome was considered a citizen. And Rome really didn't see itself as something that was an ethnically exclusive institution. Instead, anybody that was willing to come to Rome, learn to speak Latin or Greek, and get along with Roman government and Roman institutions would be considered kind of part of the great Roman machine. And so if you wanted to set yourself apart as different from that, like these magister milites generally did, you had to make a certain amount of effort. You had to show yourself and present yourself and describe yourself as different, as not part of just kind of yet another Roman family. And so Odoacer does this in part by having a mustache. Right? He rules as king of Italy. Dun, dun, dun. This did not really cause that much of a stir in Italy itself. It did, however, cause something of a stir in the East. Zeno, who's the Eastern emperor at this point, you'll note that every time we say the name of an emperor, it's a different name. Personnel changes. We're also moving kind of fast here, so just roll with it. Anyway, Zeno is now the Eastern emperor, and he sees an opportunity to kill two birds with one stone. He can't allow Odoacer just to topple the chosen emperor of the Eastern I'm sorry, let me clarify that. What Odoacer has essentially done by killing Romulus Augustulus and taking his place is he's also ignoring the instructions of the Eastern Roman emperor who had wanted Julius Nepos, who was assassinated sometime before, to be on the throne. He's ignoring the right of the Eastern emperor to have a say over who is going to rule Italy. Now, Odoacer does apply for approval and recognition, and he really hoped that by calling himself king of Italy instead of emperor, he's more likely to get that recognition. But Zeno doesn't see it that way. Zeno definitely looks at this situation and sees an upstart, somebody that is trying to leapfrog over his authority. He wants to punish Odoacer. But he doesn't really have the handy troops ready to do that. He doesn't have the resources to do that. That's why it's been so chaotic in Rome this whole time. And yet he also has a different problem. You see that guy in the painting? And whoever this painter was, a modern painter, obviously, they decided to go with crazy eyes for some reason. But there aren't a lot of images of him, so I had to use what I could find. At any rate, that guy is Theoderick, king of the Ostrogoths. Remember how the Goths split into East and West? The Visigoths are now happily living in Spain. Alaric is dead, but, they're happily settled over there. The East Goths were still bouncing around inside the Roman territory over by where the Eastern Emperor was strong. They're in, what is now Macedonia, Croatia, a region at the time that was known as Pannonia. And they had established themselves as quite powerful. They were frequent foederati. They served alongside Roman legions, but they were so powerful that they didn't necessarily acknowledge the Eastern Roman Emperor's ability to push them around. And for that reason, they're constantly troublesome. And in order to prevent them from getting just out of hand, what the Eastern Emperor had done was demand hostages. When the Ostrogoths came to peace treaties with the Romans demanded political hostages. It's a very common practice in the ancient world. And so one of those political hostages was this kid, Theoderick. He was about 10 at the time, and from the time he was 10 to the time he was about 20 when his father dies, he lives in Constantinople. He was raised in Constantinople, and he was treated with every courtesy, much the way Philip of Macedon was raised in Thebes. He was treated with every courtesy, and he is allowed to have all kinds of insight into Roman military practice, Roman political practice. He is going to grow up in the court of Constantinople, and he's going to get a front row seat to see exactly how imperial administrations are run. He knows all the powerful figures. He knows who is who. He knows who to put pressure on and where and how to put pressure. He understands budgeting. He understands bureaucracy. He understands all of that because he grows up in Constantinople. He also speaks fluent Greek, which is helpful to him, as well as Latin and Gothic. So there's Theoderick. Once his father dies, he's going to leave Constantinople and return to his people to take command of them in, as I said earlier, I'll show you a map in just a second, kind of what is just an area sort of to the north of Greece. And from that position, he is going to end up putting a ton of pressure on Zeno. Every time Theoderick wants something, more money, better conditions, some kind of a better political deal, he just uses his Gothic army to put pressure on the Eastern Emperor. And he's so powerful, he just keeps winning at this. He keeps getting the upper hand. Zeno was forced to make him Magister Militis of the East. Zeno was forced to cut him all kinds of concessions. Zeno was forced to deal with him day in and day out. Zeno hates his guts at this point and wants to get rid of him. So he sees this opportunity is a fantastic chance. He wants to do something about Odoacer, king of Italy. He also wants to do something about Theoderick, king of the Ostrogoths. So he's like, here's my good idea. Ready? Okay, Theoderick, how about you take your army of Goths and anybody else who wants to go with you, Alans, Gepids, whatever they might be, gather them all up and go into Italy and deal with this Odoacer character. Get rid of him, and I will give you Italy to rule in his place. You can be king of Italy. It's not that I object to having a king of Italy, mind. I just don't like this guy. So you go there, and I'll let you rule Italy. Deal? Deal. And so Theoderick decides this is a great idea. He's going to do it. That coin on the bottom, Zeno is the one on the top that shows Zeno there. The coin on the bottom shows Theoderick, king of Italy. You'll see him there. And once again, you can see the stylistic difference that's being presented. He's got this odd sort of bowl haircut in there, and then the mustache. This was something that Romans did not do. Roman men sometimes wore full beards. That was a fairly common enough thing to do. They wore full beards, or they wore themselves clean shaven, but they did not have just a mustache. That's a barbarian thing to do. Okay, so there we go. Alrighty, so here's the map, as I promised. Now, just ignore the fact that it's in German. It gives you at least a visual sense of what's going on. So, Theoderick and his Gothic army has got the following deal. If they can take back Italy from Odoacer, they get to keep it. And so Theoderick marches his army into the Italian peninsula, and he's going to win a series of dazzlingly fast victories against Odoacer's forces. Odoacer, however, retreats to Ravenna. That's that city surrounded by the swamp, super defensible. You need a navy to take Ravenna, and Theoderick doesn't have a navy. And so they're at this stalemate. It's this long siege. Odoacer's dug in the swamp city, and Theodoric's controlling the land of the rest of the peninsula. And so neither can really effectively completely win because Odoacer simply won't leave. And as long as he's holding Ravenna, he's technically still kind of in charge. And yet he's not effectively in charge because Theodoric is controlling the rest of the country. So, after the siege goes on for a while, Odoacer and Theodoric agree to a meeting to come to an understanding, a deal to share power in Italy. This is going to be the plan. At that meeting, Theodoric is allowed to enter Ravenna on his own with just a couple of retainers with him, and then sit down at the table with Odoacer to have a discussion about what's going to happen. Theoderick walks in by himself, and then it's a little bit like something out of a scene from The Godfather. If you have not ever seen the original Godfather movie, you should watch it. It's cool. It's a classic. You should know it. But if you have, you know what I'm talking about. Theoderick walks in, he sits down at the dining table, he starts listening to the courtesies, he starts listening to the offer on the table, and then at one point he stands up, pulls out a knife, and stabs his rival to death. He just stabs Odoacer himself with his own hands, and then calmly and quietly just walks out again to rejoin his army. After the death of Odoacer, and nobody really stops him, so this must have been, at least in some part, an inside job, but once this happens, Theodoric is left in sole control of Italy. He is the only one in charge. And so it's 493, and he's going to take over the country as King of Italy. Now, you would imagine, given this situation, that the rule of Theodoric, King of Italy, the barbarian, really ought to be something that was probably going to be rough and terrible and cruel, and yet another example of horrible chaos that the Italians are going to have to live through. Shockingly, no. Theodoric's reign as King of Italy was very successful. He had spent 10 years in Constantinople, after all. He knows how to run a bureaucracy. He knows how to run an imperial administration. He knows how to do this. And he goes out of his way to make himself appealing as a ruler. So, in many ways, he's much kinder and more considerate than anybody who'd been in charge of Italy for some time at this point. For instance, when there were crop failures or destruction in northern Italy because of natural disaster, he will simply tell that region that they are forgiven their taxes for that year. They don't have to pay them. And when neighboring people threaten to attack, Theodoric is extremely effective in defending the borders. He is very diplomatically effective against his sort of neighboring peoples and alongside the neighboring peoples. The Ostrogoths get along very well with the Visigoths, for instance. And they cut really effective deals with Vandals and Franks for the most part. They do have a few battles in there, but most part they get along reasonably well, and they create an atmosphere of security. Italy can take a deep breath for the first time in forever because Theodoric does effectively bring about stability and security for the peninsula. He's going to rule for about 20 years, and during that time, Italy is going to have a respite from the constant chaotic political upheavals and the constant warfare and destruction that they'd been living with prior to his reign. And on top of that, Theodoric has a great deal of political skill as well. He may style himself as a barbarian with his mustache and bowl haircut, and he may emphasize his role as kind of the outsider for his own political reasons. But at the same time, he does know how to run the show. He's very good with the Senate. He's polite to them. He's courteous. He acknowledges their traditional role, and he kind of leaves them in peace without making them sort of regret the day they were born. as they sort of feared might happen when he took power. And for a while, he also has a very good relationship with the Catholic Church. Now, I told you before it would be important, and here's why it is. Theoderick the Ostrogoth, like most of his followers, is a Christian, but he is an Aryan Christian. That's because the Ostrogoths converted to Christianity under the instruction of Valens. And Valens, way back in the day with Adrianople, was an Arian. And so when the Goths converted, they converted to Arian Christianity. The majority church in Rome itself is a Nicene church. It's a church that the Catholic Church is one that does not embrace Arianism. It's one that embraces that other form of the Trinity where it's God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit are all equal and co-eternal. And so, since they're not technically part of the same church, Theoderick is going to have a unique relationship with the Catholic Church. On the one hand, he's going to build churches of his own. I'll show you pictures in just a second. So we'll just move on. He's going to build churches of his own, like San Apollinare Nuovo, which is this one, and decorate it lavishly. And these are going to be Arian churches for him and for his Gothic followers to go and attend services. And he's going to have his own Arian clergy that are going to serve that church. But on the other hand, he's going to work very closely with the leaders of the Nicene Catholic Church in Rome itself as well. The Pope, who really starts becoming referred to as the Pope at right around this same time period. It's just a sort of a slang term, if you will. It's from Papa, just means father, Pope. But he's going to work very closely with the leader, the Bishop of Rome, the leader of the Catholic Church. He's going to give the church political support. He's going to give the church money in a few famous instances. He is going to back them up. But most important of all, when Theoderick deals with the Catholic Church, he does his best to stay out of it. Instead of embracing the notion of Caesaropapism, where because he's the king, he believes he ought to be able to just boss around and the church and tell them what to do and what to believe and what clergy are sanctioned and what clergy are not sanctioned and what they ought to do. Instead, he simply says, look, I'm a barbarian. I belong to this Aryan church. It's a totally different thing. I'm not going to tell you what to believe. I'm not going to tell you how to run your business and your organization. I realize the Catholic Church is by far the majority here, that most people are on board with that. I'm not going to mess with you. I'll give you all the protection that you need. I'll give you all the support that you need. But I am not going to actually meddle in your affairs. This is a massive transformation in the relationship between the Catholic Church and the government. And really it is created by this, space that was provided by the Arian Ostrogothic king of Italy taking over. And so in part for this reason, and because the clergy are going to record a lot of the actual history of this time that survives to us, and in part because of all of the things I already mentioned, where he was kind to those who were suffering natural disasters or setbacks, where he was famously merciful in dealing with political enemies, where he was an incredibly apt and capable administrator and effective at protecting the borders. This period is remembered by Romans as a golden age. Remember when Theoderick the Ostrogoth was running Italy? It was so great. Yeah, so there's a king in Italy, and the Italians are great with it. Now, that being said, I should emphasize a specific aspect of how the church and its relationships with Theoderick end up forging a kind of new relationship with the empire, with imperial power altogether. This guy there on your left is named Gelasius. Gelasius was the pope during Theoderick's reign. And what happens with Gelasius is that he gets into a dispute. Now, this is nothing new. It was very common for popes to get into disputes with other bishops around the empire, particularly the patriarch or bishop of Constantinople. The Bishop of Constantinople would almost always be under the direct observation and influence of whoever was emperor in the East at the time. And they are going to, therefore, sometimes get into conflicts with other bishops elsewhere in the empire, and particularly with Rome. Rome had struggled for some time, ever since Leo I. We're not going to get into all of it, but Rome had been, for the past almost century at this stage, trying to carve out a special niche for itself in Christian hierarchy. They claimed that because they were founded by St. Peter once upon a time, that Rome should be given special primacy in theological matters. Constantinople argues with this because they're like, yeah, but the emperor is actually telling us what to do, and that whole Caesaropapism thing. And so, therefore, you are not going to be in charge of stuff, Rome. Instead, Constantinople is just as important as you are. So that was already a bit of a debate. And then Gelasius gets into an argument with the Patriarch of Constantinople, and the emperor intervenes. And he's the Eastern Emperor. And he sends a sharply worded letter to Gelasius saying, do what the Patriarch of Constantinople says, or else. Gelasius sends a letter back. And the only reason he's bold enough to do this is because he is living under the reign of Theoderick the Ostrogoth. And Theoderick has his back. And Theoderick does not care if he gets into a fight with the Patriarch or the Emperor or anybody else. If anything, Theoderick finds the whole deal amusing. So, Gelasius sends a firmly worded letter back to the emperor that basically espouses what's known as the Two Swords Doctrine. He says, look, here's the deal. There are two kinds of power in the world: force, potestas, and authority, auctoritas. If you have a sword or an army and you can make people do what you want, you have potestas, you have force. That's what you've got. That's the kind of power you have in your hand. And so when you give people an order, they have to do it or else. But there's another kind of power. The kind of power where people will listen to you out of respect for your right to ask it of them, whatever it is you're asking, out of respect for your judgment, out of respect for your place, that you've earned the right. And that's authority. So even if you don't have a sword or a stick or an army, if you say to people, I want you to do this, they do it out of respect for you. Of those two, you, the emperor, have force. I, the pope, have authority. And if you're talking about morals, and if we're talking about your eternal soul, if ever there is a conflict for a Christian between choosing to obey someone with force and choosing to obey someone with authority, the person whose power truly is greater, who truly is superior, is the person with authority. And that, between the two of us, Pope and Emperor, is me, the Pope, not you, the Emperor. This was an incredibly bold implication. And he gets away with it. He gets away with it. He doesn't get punished by the Eastern Emperor because the Eastern Emperor can't do anything, because Gelasius is under the umbrella but not under the control of Theoderick the Ostrogoth. Okay. So, the separation of church and state, in other words, is starting to happen in the West. It's not going to actually be separate for a long time. Don't worry about it. But this idea that the government would necessarily control the church and not the other way around is starting to break down. Okay, so what happens to the Ostrogoths? Well, Theoderick dies of natural causes. His throne passes to his grandson because he didn't have a legitimate son. He did have a legitimate daughter named Amalasuentha. And Amalasuentha was Theodoric's pride and joy. She was highly, highly educated, fluent in Greek, Latin, and Gothic. She could read and write in all of them. And she was prepared and groomed from the time she was quite young to ultimately take over Theodoric's kingdom. Now, she is married and she has a young son, and technically Alaric, her young son, is named as Theodoric's heir, but Amalasuentha was chosen as regent to rule until her son is adult. But she immediately runs into trouble because there's a conflict. The Roman political leaders want to oversee the upbringing and education of Alaric themselves. Meanwhile, Gothic military leaders, the leaders of the army, the generals who've served with Theoderic, don't want that to happen. They want to oversee the education of Alaric themselves, and both of them want to undercut the authority of Amalasuentha. And so she makes a terrible mistake. in this situation, she's trying to figure out how she can maintain control of the situation. And so with the Senate, someone she can't call on, and with the generals she can't call on, she appeals to Constantinople, the Eastern Roman Emperor. And this is a mistake. Amalasuentha sends a letter to this guy, Justinian, and asks for his help and support. Justinian's story is... I'm going to give you the very fast version of it. His grandfather was a goat herder. His father was in the army. His name was Justin. And Justin was given the task when the emperor died of passing around a bunch of money in order to bribe various important generals and political figures to proclaim Justin's boss the new emperor. Justin is not stupid, so he's like, well, I've got all the money in my hand. I'll just bribe them to declare me the emperor. And so that works, shockingly enough. And Justin becomes the emperor, and he rules for a short time, and then he dies, and his son Justinian takes over. So that's Justinian. Justinian is sometimes referred to as the last of the Latin emperors, the last of the Western emperors, even though he rules primarily in the East, for two reasons. One, he has grand ambitions to reconquer the entire empire again, once more. Two, is that he's the last of the emperors to speak Latin. The emperors who come after this, who rule out of Constantinople, are going to really be Greek-based, and they're going to speak Greek, and that's going to be it. Justinian, because his father came up through the army, speaks Latin. He's the last of the emperors who's going to be able to do so. But he does have grand and glorious ambitions to reconquer the entire empire. And when Amalasuentha's letter shows up and says, hi, I'm supposed to be regent here, but I'm having trouble maintaining control over both the Gothic forces and the Senate. Could you do something? He's like, yes, I can. So Justinian dispatches armies to try to retake the entire empire. Now, there are three major targets that he has in mind. Ostrogothic Italy, Visigothic Spain, and Vandal North Africa. The Vandals we only just mentioned in passing. As I remarked, their name ends up becoming kind of a rude word, meaning somebody who is, I guess, destructively criminal. And they earned that in part because they looted churches, which made clergy angry, and clergy write the history, so there you go. But what is less well known is the fact that once the pillaging was done and the Vandals settled in North Africa, they actually ushered in an era of tremendous prosperity in the territory that they controlled, in part because North Africa at the time had not been desertified. It wasn't a desert in the way that it is now. Instead, there was quite a lot of grain produced in this territory, which is now in Libya largely. And those grain supplies were not shipped off to Constantinople or to Rome. Instead, they were sold on the market, and local people enjoyed a period of unprecedented prosperity and peacefulness. So Vandal North Africa was actually pretty prosperous and doing well until Justinian takes it back over, and the grain shipments are once again hauled on off to Constantinople. But once he's in control of North Africa, that gives him an excellent staging point to leap on off to go after the Visigoths in Spain, where he's relatively successful. He pushes them to the north. They end up having to split their territory with him. And then Ostrogothic Italy. And that that campaign was a mess, in part because there's a lot of potential glory involved. Justinian doesn't have the time or inclination to do it himself, so he has to send a general named Belisarius. And he doesn't want the general to get too powerful or too much glory out of this whole thing. So he keeps Belisarius on a shoestring and never gives him quite enough support. And he encounters quite serious resistance in Ostrogothic Italy. And so as a result, this war goes on for 20 years. And it's 20 hard-fought, miserable, destructive years, which ends up with crops destroyed, food shortages, towns leveled, things just a mess. And at the end of it, more damage was done to the Italian peninsula than had ever been done by a barbarian invasion. Justinian wrecks the place. And then, after finishing wrecking the place, rather than following the example of somebody like Theoderick, who gave people tax leniency, for instance, when disasters struck, Justinian is going to send officials who demand not only that the Romans sitting in the ruins of their fabulous towns and villages pay their taxes for the year, but that they pay the back taxes that they owed the Ostrogoths. It was not pretty. He's not going to hang on to Italy for long, but I'll explain why in just a bit. Before we do that, though, let's talk about some of the other accomplishments of Justinian. He is going to issue something called the Corpus Juris Civilis, and it's an effort to make sense of the Roman law code. Up until this point, every new emperor issued new laws, and whatever the most recent law that had been issued was on the books, that was the law that was supposed to be in effect. The problem was that there had been so many emperors and so many laws, and it was almost impossible to track down if you were talking about some relatively obscure court case, what exactly the current law was on any given situation. And so you had people who were professional kind of jurists, so roughly the equivalent of lawyers, who would constantly search through libraries and try to chase down precedent and chase down law cases. And it was really a lot of work, and it was hard. Nobody really knew what the law was at any given time on any given subject. Without having to do a ton of research, and then you could only be as certain as reasonably that you'd reasonably had a good chance of finding out any edict that might be outstanding somewhere. So what Justinian does is he hauls together a bunch of these legal scholars, and he sits them down and he says, look, here's the project. I want you to compile a copy of absolutely every Roman law code on the books, put them in sort of chronological order, have all of them, put a little explanation next to them explaining what they're about and who they apply to, so that you have one giant repository of what the laws are. And then separately, I want you to give me a short version of what the current laws are on all subjects in one handy, well, it's usually several volumes, one handy set of volumes, so that if we want to know what the law is, we don't have to go searching through libraries. Instead, we just pull down the copy of the law code, and it's right there spelled out for us. There you go. This effort not only made law practice easier in Justinian's day and for Justinian's administrators, it's also going to be the foundation of the study of ancient and imperial law in the West. This is going to be the foundation of Renaissance studies centuries later. So it's going to be very influential going forward as well as at the time. Okay, so some more problematic issues with Justinian. At the time he was emperor, the most popular kind of public performance display was the chariot race. And it was held at something called the Hippodrome, which is where the track was, where the chariots would run around the big track, and the stands were there and people would watch. Gladiatorial contests were not that popular in the East at this point. They really had fallen out of disuse. Instead, people went to the chariot races. And the chariot races had this kind of odd double function. As you can see in Constantinople, the Hippodrome was right next to the great palace of the emperor. And the emperor would come out in his imperial box. And like the gladiatorial shows, this is one of the very few places where common people could actually see and interact directly with the emperor. If they chanted a chant, the emperor would hear it. And so sometimes they did chant political chants at these things to try to get their opinions heard and understood by the emperor. And partly for this reason, the sports fans who would go and watch the chariot races kind of took on a political aspect to themselves as well. There were teams, like the Blues, they were named for colors, like the Blues and the Greens were the two famous ones, that would go and run the chariot races, but they became associated with political standpoints. They were political factions as well as sports teams. The closest thing I can think of in modern life would be, I guess, kind of like a Yankees Red Sox division, where it's being a Yankees fan or a Red Sox fan has kind of implications beyond simply living in one town or supporting one particular team over another. It's not just about sports. There's some social context there too. Well, this is like that, but times 10. So the team you supported in the Hippodrome reflected your political views as well as your personal views as well as your sports views, I guess. And so things got fairly heated occasionally. And what happens in 532 is that a riot breaks out. There's a chariot racing fan clubs were in attendance. There was a riot between the Blues and the Greens, and it gets out of hand in the Hippodrome. The Hippodrome is right next to the palace, and the emperor freaking freaks out. He's like, there's rioting, chaos practically in the palace, and I'm in danger, and this is terrible, and I don't know what to do. And so he sends in the army to slaughter the sports fans. This, as you can imagine, does not have Justinian's intended effect. He was hoping to calm down the rioting. But when you send in the army to slaughter sports fans, it does not calm down rioting. It creates rioting elsewhere in the city. And the city basically catches on fire, and there's riots left and right, and there's all kinds of problems. And it looks like Justinian is coming down. He considers fleeing the city, but his wife Theodora is going to talk him out of it. If you read Procopius, he writes, he's a historian at the time, he worked for Justinian and Theodora, but he writes something called The Secret History that was not part of his work for them, but instead he basically writes the most scathing, hurtful, critical account of Justinian and Theodora you could possibly imagine. He accuses them of murdering 1 trillion people, for instance. It's a little exaggerated. He describes how Justinian was a coward and a horrible person, and Theodora is no better than a hooker, and he doesn't spare anybody's feelings in this. But in his account, he says that Justinian was all on the point of fleeing. He was going to leave, but Theodora shames him into standing his ground. And the famous quote being that those who have worn the crown should never survive its loss. The purple, which is the color that emperors were specifically allowed to wear, makes a fine winding sheet, and that would be the shroud he would be buried in. So basically, if you're the king, it's the Game of Thrones. You win or you die. If you're wondering where George R.R. Martin got that idea from, there you go. Anyway, so they stand their ground, and in the end, when the dust settles, it's this massive political black eye for him. The crowds have lost faith in Justinian and Theodora. It looked bad. It was just awful, and thousands of people are dead, and so Justinian is in trouble. Justinian was in trouble, so he has to go basically apologize to the Bishop of Constantinople. The Patriarch of Constantinople is another title he's sometimes referred to by. A guy at the time named John Chrysostom. And John Chrysostom, that means golden mouth, in case you're wondering. He was an excellent speaker. He was no one to be trifled with. And he takes advantage of this moment when the emperor is weak to push on that notion of Caesaropapism. So when Justinian's like, I killed a lot of people, but I guess I'll attend church. John Chrysostom was like, no. You're not attending church until you have made some kind of public apology and done some penance. And so Justinian has to, Justinian has to make up for some of what he's done. He restores order to the city, and then he has to make a major donation. He agrees to build, and after making a public penance and apology and abasing himself in front of the Patriarch of Constantinople and making a public show of how he's sorry and he agrees to follow the dictates and teachings of Christianity and the guidance of the Patriarch of Constantinople, he agrees to make a donation of, as you can see Justinian there, handing over, not a model, but in fact, the great church of the Hagia Sophia. The Holy Church of Holy Wisdom, as it was known, as it is known, that's the name of it. The minarets were not there at the time, they were added later, but this church was the greatest, I would say greatest is the wrong word, it's the largest, in terms of area and volume, church in Christian history at the time. It was, I think it still is, and it was built as this massive monument to his regret, I suppose you could say, to make up for the terrible thing he'd done in encouraging the Nika riots and the suppression of the Nika riots, which ended up with about 30,000 people dead in his own capital city. And so Justinian has to pay to build the most monumentally fantastic cool church of the later Roman Empire that still exists, and it's still there. It's gone through all kinds of exciting history itself. It was built by Justinian. It's had to be repaired several times. The dome itself is a wonder of human accomplishment. It was a Christian church for many years. Then it was converted to a mosque. That's where the minarets come in. Then it was kind of decommissioned and made into a museum. And then recently it's been turned back into a mosque. So that's where it is right now. You can go see it if you like. Okay. To give you some sense of the scale of it, because the external picture really doesn't capture that. This is the interior of the Hagia Sophia. Those little bitty specks down there at the bottom are people. And this gives you some sense of what it's like on the inside. This dome was meant to put people in mind of the dome of the heavens. It was supposed to be staggering and to give you a sense of your own kind of human frailty in the presence of the divine. And it certainly does do that. And it was beautifully, lavishly decorated with gold mosaic all over the place. Some of it is still intact. As you can see, the apse, which is where the altar would have been when it was a Christian church, is decorated with gold mosaic. There's a nativity scene there. There's Mary with Jesus. And you can sort of see the gleam of the gold still. There were some other images as well that have been damaged over the years or have been taken down. The medallions that you see in the picture on the left with calligraphy in them, those were added later. Okay, so that's the Hagia Sophia. Justinian had to pay the big bucks to have that sucker built. Okay, so what ultimately becomes of Justinian's efforts to reform the empire, to reunite it and bring it back to its ancient greatness? Well, he might have had some shot at accomplishing this and creating lasting unity, were it not for the fact that plague breaks out. Sometime between 541 and 542, an episode of bubonic plague, just like the Black Death that kills everybody in Europe later in the 1350s. That is going to break out in Europe, starting in the Mediterranean in the Eastern Roman Empire, and spreading westward from there during this time period. So Justinian's trying to retake and reunify the entire empire, and then in 541, plague absolutely disrupts all of his efforts. It was not, as far as archaeology will show us, and we don't know as much as we would like to, admittedly, but it was not as devastating as the Black Death. It doesn't seem like you have the same millions of people dying. It doesn't seem to have taken out a third of Europe's population, for instance, but it does take out a lot of people, perhaps as much as a quarter of the population of the Eastern Mediterranean, and then somewhat less than that in the West, are going to die. It was a massive, catastrophic pandemic, and it ultimately disrupts everything that Justinian was trying to accomplish in terms of his military and political reconsolidation. So, there you have it, functionally the end of the Western Empire. Bum, bum, bum. Next time, we'll talk about successor states. Who will come to power once Rome is no longer the only game in town? Okay, so we'll pick up there next time. Thanks a lot. Bye.